You don't forget the woman you once promised forever to, especially not when she's standing across the room, carrying a life you never knew existed. The crystal chandelier above cast a soft golden glow across the dining room of LeClaire, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, where every tablecloth was pressed to perfection and every glass sparkled like it had never been touched before, and Adrian Cole sat at the center of it all like he belonged there, because he did, his tailored navy suit fitting him like a second skin, his watch catching the light just enough to hint at a price tag most people would never dare ask about, while, across from him, his fiancée Vanessa laughed lightly at something he hadn't quite heard, her manicured fingers resting on the edge of her wine glass, her presence elegant, flawless, everything his life had become over the past year, structured, polished, predictable, and exactly the way it was supposed to be after the mess he had carefully buried behind him. Adrian? Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her smile still in place, but her eyes searching. You're not even pretending to listen anymore, she teased, and he blinked, forcing himself back into the moment, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sorry, long day. He replied smoothly, the kind of excuse that always worked, the kind that required no further explanation. And yet something had shifted, something subtle at first, like a flicker in his peripheral vision, a presence that didn't belong to the carefully curated world he had built, and his gaze drifted, just for a second, past Vanessa's shoulder, past the neatly arranged tables and the low hum of quiet conversations, until it landed on a figure moving quickly between tables, balancing a tray with practiced care, her uniform simple, her posture slightly tense. And there was nothing remarkable about her at first glance, nothing that should have made his chest tighten the way it suddenly did, but then she turned. Just enough for the light to catch her face, and everything inside him stilled, because he knew that face, even after all this time, even after everything that had happened. Clara Bennett, his ex-wife, the woman he had once built a life with and then walked away from as if it had meant nothing, and for a moment, his mind refused to process what he was seeing, because it didn't fit, it didn't make sense. Clara didn't belong here. Not like this. Not in a server's uniform. Not moving quickly to avoid attention. Not looking like she carried the weight of something far heavier than a tray of wine glasses. And then his eyes dropped, almost involuntarily, and that's when the world tilted, because beneath the fabric of her uniform, unmistakable and impossible to ignore, was the curve of her stomach, rounded, full, the unmistakable sign of pregnancy, and his breath caught in his throat as his mind scrambled to reject what his eyes were telling him. No, that couldn't be right. It had to be the angle, the lighting, anything but what it looked like, because the timeline didn't add up. It couldn't. They had been divorced for months, nearly half a year, their separation clean. Final, deliberate, no loose ends, no reasons to look back. And yet there she was, across the room, carrying a child. And the thought hit him before he could stop it, sharp and uninvited. Whose child is that, Adrian? Vanessa's voice cut through the silence in his head, softer this time, edged with something closer to concern, and he realized he had been staring, his focus locked on Clara in a way that was impossible to hide, and he forced himself to look away, to pull his attention back to the woman sitting in front of him, the life he had chosen, the future he had already set in motion, but it was too late. Because the image was already burned into his mind. Clara, pregnant, working in a place like this. Looking thinner than he remembered, more fragile, and yet somehow stronger at the same time. And as he reached for his glass, his hand paused midair, because across the room, Clara stumbled slightly, just for a second, the tray tilting enough to send a soft ripple of tension through the nearby tables. And before she could steady it, a sharp voice cut through the elegant atmosphere, her manager stepping in with a tight expression. His words low but clearly not kind, and Clara lowered her gaze, nodding quickly, her free hand instinctively brushing against her stomach as if to protect it. And something inside Adrian shifted again, deeper this time, heavier, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in a long time. Because suddenly this wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just an uncomfortable reunion. It was something else, something unresolved, something that refused to stay buried. And as Clara turned slightly, her face pale under the soft lighting, one hand still resting over her stomach, Adrian felt the first crack in the perfect life he had built begin to spread, because no matter how much he tried to ignore it, one question refused to let go, and it echoed louder with every passing second. What if the timeline he trusted was wrong? Vanessa followed his line of sight before he could stop her, her eyes narrowing slightly as she spotted the direction of his attention. And although she did not yet recognize the woman across the room, she recognized something else far more dangerous. The shift in Adrian's demeanor, the way his posture had stiffened, the way his focus had locked onto something that clearly mattered. "Who are you looking at?" she asked, her tone light but edged with curiosity that was quickly turning into suspicion, and Adrian hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long, a mistake he almost never made, because in his world hesitation meant weakness, and weakness meant exposure. "No one," he replied, a little too quickly, reaching for his glass again, but his fingers tightened around it instead of lifting it, his gaze betraying him as it flickered back across the room despite his effort to stay composed. And Vanessa noticed, of course she did, because she had not gotten this far in life by ignoring what was right in front of her. "Adrian," she said more firmly now, setting her glass down with a soft but deliberate clink. "You are not looking at no one." And this time he exhaled slowly, the carefully constructed calm he carried beginning to crack under the weight of something he could not control. "It is just someone I used to know," he admitted, the understatement almost absurd even to his own ears, because there was nothing simple about Clara Bennett. Not now, not ever, and certainly not standing across the room carrying a child that should not exist within the timeline he had built his certainty around. Vanessa tilted her head, studying him more closely now, her instincts sharpening. "Used to know?" she repeated, her voice quieter but far more focused, and Adrian knew that tone. It was the one she used when she sensed something important, something worth digging into, and he should have shut it down. Redirected the conversation, returned to the script of the perfect evening. But instead his eyes betrayed him again as Clara shifted under the manager's watchful gaze, nodding quickly before moving toward another table, her movements careful now, controlled, one hand never straying far from her stomach. And something about that small, protective gesture hit harder than anything else, because it was instinctive, unguarded, real, and it clashed violently with everything he had convinced himself was true. "She is my ex-wife," he said finally, the words leaving his mouth before he could reconsider them. And Vanessa's expression changed instantly, surprise flashing across her face before it settled into something more calculated, more aware. "Your ex-wife?" she repeated, turning her attention fully toward Clara now, her gaze assessing in a way that was almost clinical, taking in the uniform, the posture, the visible pregnancy, and Adrian could almost see the conclusions forming in her mind, the comparisons, the silent judgments, the questions she had not yet voiced. "You never mentioned she worked here," Vanessa added, and Adrian let out a quiet breath, because that detail was the least of it. "She did not," he replied, his voice lower now, more distant, as if he were speaking from somewhere else entirely, because his thoughts were no longer at the table. They were across the room, replaying every detail, every movement, every second of what he had just seen. "We have not spoken since the divorce," he continued, almost to himself, and that was the truth, a clean break, no contact, no loose threads, or at least that was what he had believed, until now, until this moment that refused to fit into any version of reality he could accept. Vanessa leaned back slightly, crossing her arms as she studied him, her expression unreadable but far from indifferent. "And now she is pregnant," she said, not as a question but as a statement, one that hung heavily between them, and Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, because hearing it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it had not, and his mind began to do what it always did: calculate, analyze, search for logic. In chaos, 6 months since the divorce, nearly 7 since they had last lived together, timelines, dates, memories, all of it colliding in a way that refused to settle into something clear, something certain. And yet there was a flicker, a single moment that refused to stay buried, a night he had dismissed, written off as nothing more than a final, meaningless overlap in a marriage that was already over. And now, as he watched Clara carefully set down a glass at another table, her hand trembling just slightly before she steadied it, That memory began to resurface with a clarity he could not ignore, because if he had miscalculated even one detail, if he had overlooked even one moment, then everything he believed about that clean ending might have been wrong. And the thought settled heavily in his chest as his gaze fixed on her once more, sharper now, more focused. No longer just shock, but something else entirely beginning to take hold, something far more dangerous than surprise, doubt. The room had not changed. The music still soft, the conversation still low and controlled, the clinking of glasses still measured and polite, and yet everything felt different to Adrian now, as if the entire atmosphere had shifted without anyone else noticing, as if the polished elegance of the restaurant had become nothing more than a backdrop to something far more personal and far more unsettling. And across the table Vanessa sat perfectly composed, her posture flawless, her expression calm. But her eyes remained fixed on him, watching, calculating, waiting for him to reveal more than he intended to, while his own attention kept slipping away from her, pulled back again and again toward Clara, who moved carefully from table to table, each step deliberate, each motion slightly slower than it should have been, as if she were conserving energy, as if every movement required more effort than she was willing to show. And the contrast between the two women could not have been sharper. Vanessa in her tailored dress, her world defined by control and perfection, and Clara in a simple uniform, her life clearly shaped by something far more fragile, something that could not be hidden beneath polished surfaces. And Adrian felt the weight of that contrast settle uncomfortably in his chest, because it forced a comparison he had never intended to make, one that brought with it questions he had spent months avoiding. "You look like you have seen a ghost," Vanessa said quietly, her voice steady but no longer light. And he almost laughed at the accuracy of it, because in a way that was exactly what this felt like, the past standing right in front of him, refusing to stay buried. "It is just unexpected," he replied, though the word felt insufficient for what was actually happening inside him, because unexpected did not begin to cover the way his thoughts were unraveling, the way his certainty was slipping, the way every detail he had once trusted was now being re-examined under a harsher light. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to keep the conversation private. "And the baby?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for a reaction he could not fully hide. And there it was again, spoken aloud, undeniable, forcing him to confront the one question he had been trying not to fully form, and his jaw tightened as he looked away for a brief second, his mind already running through the numbers again. Months, weeks, specific dates that once felt clear and now seemed disturbingly flexible, because memory was not as precise as he had believed, and there were gaps, moments he had dismissed, nights he had chosen not to think about, and now those gaps felt dangerous, because they could hold something he had not accounted for, something that changed everything. "I do not know," he said finally, the honesty of it sitting heavily between them. And Vanessa's expression shifted, not into sympathy, but into something sharper, more alert, as if she had just realized the situation was far more complicated than she had initially assumed. "You do not know," she repeated, her tone quieter now, more controlled, and Adrian exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting back across the room once more, drawn to Clara as she paused near the service station, her hand resting briefly against the counter as if steadying herself, her shoulders rising and falling with a controlled breath. And something about that small moment, that flicker of vulnerability she tried to hide, made it impossible for him to simply dismiss this as coincidence, because Clara had never been careless, never been reckless. She had always been deliberate, thoughtful, the kind of person who planned ahead, who considered consequences. And the idea that she would suddenly be in this position without reason did not align with the woman he had known, and that realization brought a new layer of tension, because if this was not random, if this was not someone else's story intersecting briefly with his, then it meant there was a connection he had not fully understood, something that tied him to this moment in a way he could not ignore. And as he watched her straighten slightly, adjusting the tray in her hands before moving again, his thoughts sharpened, shifting from confusion to something more focused, more intentional, because uncertainty was not something he tolerated for long, not in business and certainly not in his personal life. And whatever this was, whatever truth was hidden behind that single impossible detail, he was no longer willing to sit across the room and pretend it did not exist. Adrian set his glass down slowly, the faint clink against the table barely audible beneath the soft hum of the restaurant. But to him it sounded louder than it should have, as if it marked a decision he could no longer delay, because sitting still had become impossible, pretending had become pointless, and the longer he remained in his seat, the more the questions in his mind tightened their grip, turning from distant thoughts into something far more urgent, more demanding. And across from him, Vanessa watched the shift happen in real time, her posture still composed, but her gaze sharpening as she realized he was no longer present with her, not truly. "You are thinking about going over there," she said quietly, not asking but stating, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that suggested she already knew the answer, and Adrian did not respond immediately, his eyes once again finding Clara across the room as she paused near another table, speaking softly to a couple, before carefully setting down their drinks, her movements precise but slower than they should have been. And there it was again, that subtle hesitation, that almost imperceptible strain that made it clear she was pushing through something. And it made something inside him tighten in a way he could not ignore, because it was not just about recognition anymore. It was not just about the past resurfacing. It was about the present unfolding right in front of him in a way that did not align with anything he had expected. "Adrian." Vanessa pressed slightly, her tone still controlled but firmer now. "Do not do something impulsive." And that word almost stopped him, because impulsive was not how he operated, not in business, not in life. Every move he made was calculated, deliberate, backed by logic and control. But this situation had already stepped outside of those boundaries. It had already introduced variables he could not ignore, and staying seated would not restore control. It would only prolong uncertainty. And that was something he had never tolerated well. Not when the stakes were unclear, not when the outcome could shift everything he believed to be settled. "This is not impulsive," he said finally, his voice low but steady, his decision forming even as he spoke. "This is necessary." And Vanessa's lips pressed together slightly, her expression cooling just a fraction as she absorbed that, because she understood what it meant when he used that tone, when he framed something as necessary. It meant he had already committed to it, already decided that the risk was worth the answer, and she leaned back slightly, her arms crossing once more, a subtle barrier forming between them. "She is your past," Vanessa said, her voice quieter now but carrying a sharper edge. "Do not let her become your present again." And for a brief moment, Adrian hesitated, not because her words lacked truth, but because they revealed something he had not fully acknowledged, that this was not just about a question, not just about a timeline. It was about the possibility of something unresolved pulling him back into a part of his life he had deliberately closed. And yet, even as that thought surfaced, it was overshadowed by something stronger, something that refused to be ignored, because across the room Clara shifted again, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach as she took a slow breath, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. And in that moment the distance between past and present collapsed entirely, because whatever this was, it was happening now, it was real, and it demanded more than speculation, more than silent observation, and without another word Adrian pushed his chair back, the movement smooth but decisive, drawing a brief glance from a nearby table before fading back into the quiet rhythm of the restaurant. And Vanessa did not try to stop him again, her gaze following him instead, sharp and unreadable, as he stood to his full height, adjusting his jacket with a practiced motion that did nothing to steady the tension building inside him. Because for the first time that evening, he was no longer calculating from a distance. He was stepping directly into the unknown, and as he began to move across the room, each step measured but purposeful, his focus locked onto Clara, one thought settled firmly in his mind, clear and unavoidable. He needed the truth, no matter what it cost him. The distance between them felt longer than it should have, even though it was no more than 30 feet across polished marble and neatly spaced tables. And with each step Adrian took, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade just enough for his thoughts to grow louder, sharper, more insistent, until the only thing that mattered was the figure ahead of him, Clara, who had just finished setting down a pair of glasses at a table near the far wall, her polite smile already fading the moment she turned away from the guests, her shoulders dropping slightly, as if she allowed herself a single second of relief before moving on to the next task. And it was in that unguarded moment that Adrian saw it more clearly than before. The strain she had been hiding, the careful way she carried herself, the subtle but undeniable weight she was bearing. And it made the situation feel less abstract, less like a question to solve, and more like something real, something that had already unfolded without him. And just as he was about to close the final distance between them, a sharp voice cut in again, her manager stepping directly into her path with a look that was no longer just impatient, but openly critical, his words low but firm, clearly reprimanding her for something that had gone wrong. And Clara nodded quickly, her gaze lowered, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the tray she still held. "I said table 7. Needed that order 5 minutes ago," the manager continued, his tone clipped, and Clara responded softly, her voice barely audible from where Adrian stood, but the apology in it was unmistakable, and for a brief second, she seemed to lose her balance, just enough for the tray to tilt again before she steadied it, her free hand immediately moving to her stomach as if by instinct, as if protecting something more important than the task in front of her, and that single motion sent a surge of tension through Adrian that he did not bother to hide anymore, because this was no longer just observation, it was involvement, and without thinking, without calculating the social consequences or the expectations he was interrupting, he stepped forward into the space between them, his presence immediate and impossible to ignore. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying the kind of authority that did not need to be raised to be effective, and the manager turned, his expression shifting instantly from irritation to recognition, the tension in his posture easing as he realized who he was addressing. "No problem at all, sir," he replied quickly, forcing a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes, just a small delay in service. And Adrian's gaze did not leave Clara, who had gone completely still the moment he spoke, her head lifting slowly as if she were not sure she had heard correctly, as if she needed to confirm that the voice she recognized was not just a memory playing tricks on her. And when her eyes finally met his, the impact was immediate, unmistakable, a flicker of shock crossing her face before it was quickly replaced by something more guarded, more controlled, the careful composure she had learned to rely on. But it was too late. He had already seen it, that moment of vulnerability, that crack in the wall she had built, and it only reinforced the urgency of everything he was trying to understand. "She is doing her job," Adrian continued, his tone steady as he shifted his attention briefly to the manager, not confrontational but firm enough to make his position clear, and the man nodded quickly, eager to agree. "Of course, sir, absolutely," he said, stepping back slightly as if to remove himself from the situation altogether, and within seconds he was gone, leaving a space that felt suddenly too quiet, too focused, as if the entire room had narrowed down to just the two of them. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid pressing in from both sides, until Clara finally broke the silence, her voice soft but steady despite the tension beneath it. "You should go back to your table," she said, not meeting his eyes this time, her attention fixed instead on the tray in her hands, as if focusing on something simple would keep everything else from unraveling. And Adrian did not move, did not step back, because walking away now was no longer an option, not when the truth was standing right in front of him, not when the distance between them had already been crossed. And as he studied her, really studied her, taking in every detail he had missed from across the room, one realization settled firmly into place. This was not a coincidence, and whatever she was trying to keep at a distance, he was already too close to ignore it. Clara's grip on the tray tightened just slightly, enough for the subtle tension to show in her knuckles before she forced her fingers to relax, her gaze still fixed downward, as if avoiding his eyes could somehow undo the fact that he was standing right in front of her, as if distance could be recreated simply by refusing to acknowledge it. But Adrian did not move, his presence steady, his attention unwavering, because now that he was here, now that he had crossed the line between observation and confrontation, stepping back without answers was no longer an option. "Clara," he said quietly, her name leaving his mouth with a familiarity that felt out of place in the space between them, and she flinched almost imperceptibly, the reaction small but impossible to miss, before she inhaled slowly, lifting her head just enough to meet his gaze for a brief second, long enough for the weight of recognition to settle fully on both sides. "You should not be here," she replied. Her voice controlled but softer than before, and there was something in it that went beyond simple dismissal, something closer to warning, and Adrian's brow tightened slightly, because that was not the response he had expected, not after everything, not after the shock of seeing each other again under these circumstances. "I think that decision is mine," he said evenly, his tone calm but firm, and Clara shook her head once, a quiet motion that carried more meaning than words. "No," she said, more quietly this time, her eyes dropping again as if the effort of holding his gaze was too much. "It is not." And for a moment that answer hung between them, creating a pause that felt heavier than the noise of the entire restaurant, because it suggested something he had not yet considered, something beyond embarrassment or coincidence, something deliberate, and his focus sharpened immediately. "Then explain it to me," he said, his voice lowering just enough to keep their conversation contained, controlled. But the urgency beneath it was no longer hidden, and Clara's lips pressed together, slightly as if she were holding back a response, her fingers shifting against the edge of the tray again before she finally spoke. "There is nothing to explain," she said, but the words lacked conviction, and Adrian saw it instantly, because he had spent years learning how to read people, how to detect hesitation, how to recognize when something important was being withheld, and Clara had never been good at hiding the truth from him, not completely. "You are pregnant," he said, not as a question but as a statement, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to her face, and this time she did not deny it, did not deflect, her silence confirming more than any words could have, and the air between them shifted again, tighter now, more focused. "And you expect me to believe there is nothing to explain?" he continued, his tone still measured but carrying a sharper edge, and Clara exhaled slowly, the controlled breath of someone trying to maintain composure under pressure, her shoulders rising and falling slightly as she steadied herself. "I expect you to respect boundaries," she replied, her voice stronger now, though still quiet, and Adrian's expression hardened just enough to reflect the shift, because that word, boundaries, felt misplaced in this context, as if it were being used to close a conversation that had barely begun. "We were married," he said, the reminder simple but heavy, and Clara's eyes flickered at that, something passing through them too quickly to fully name. Regret, frustration, something unresolved. "We were," she agreed, her voice softer again, "and now we are not." And for a moment it seemed like she might say more, like there was something just beneath the surface waiting to come out, but instead she shifted her weight slightly, her hand once again moving instinctively to her stomach as if grounding herself, as if reminding herself of something more important than the conversation in front of her, and that single gesture pulled Adrian's focus back to the one detail that mattered most, the one question that refused to stay unspoken, because every second this continued without clarity only made it more urgent, more unavoidable, and as he looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the exhaustion she tried to hide, the strength she forced herself to maintain, and the undeniable truth she could not conceal, his patience finally reached its limit, his voice dropping just enough to make the moment feel even more intimate, even more direct. "Clara," he said again, this time with no hesitation at all, "is it mine?" The question did not echo loudly, but it landed with a weight that seemed to press the air out of the space between them. And for a moment Clara did not move at all, her entire body going still, as if even the smallest reaction might give something away, her eyes fixed on the tray in her hands, her breathing controlled but just a fraction deeper than before, and Adrian watched her closely, every detail, every micro-expression, because her silence was not empty, it was filled with something he could not yet define, something that made the seconds stretch longer than they should have, until finally, she exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and lifted her gaze to meet his again. "You should not ask that here," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying a strain that had not been there before, and Adrian's expression did not change, because the location no longer mattered, the timing no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was the answer. "Then where should I ask it?" he replied, his tone just as controlled, but there was no mistaking the insistence beneath it, and Clara shook her head slightly, her eyes flickering for just a moment toward the surrounding tables, the people who were close enough to notice if voices rose or tension escalated, the environment that made everything feel exposed even when the conversation was quiet. "Not here," she repeated, softer now, almost as if she were asking him to let it go, to step back, to give her the distance she had been trying to maintain from the moment he walked over. But Adrian did not step back, because stepping back meant accepting uncertainty, and that was no longer something he was willing to do. Not when the stakes felt this high, not when every instinct told him that the truth was just within reach. "Clara," he said again, his voice lowering further, more focused, more direct. "I need to know." And for a brief second something shifted in her expression, something that looked dangerously close to breaking, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same guarded composure she had been holding on to. "No," she said, the word quiet but firm, and it landed differently than he expected, not like a denial, not like a simple answer, but like a barrier, something placed deliberately between them to stop the conversation from going any further. And Adrian's brow tightened slightly, because that was not enough. Not when everything else pointed in a different direction. "No what?" He pressed, his voice still controlled but sharper now. "No, it is not mine." Or "No, you are not going to tell me." And this time Clara did not look away, her eyes holding his for a moment longer, and there was something in them that made his chest tighten, something complicated, something unresolved. "No," she repeated, more quietly now, and then she shifted her weight again, her hand instinctively resting against her stomach as if grounding herself, as if reminding herself of something more important than the man standing in front of her. And that gesture did not match her answer. It did not align with the distance she was trying to create, and Adrian saw it instantly, because he was no longer just listening to her words, he was reading everything else, the hesitation, the inconsistency, the subtle details she could not fully control, and they all pointed to the same conclusion, that she was not telling him the truth, not completely. And the realization settled heavily in his mind, sharpening his focus even further, because now this was no longer just a question, it was a contradiction, and contradictions demanded resolution. "You are lying," he said quietly, not as an accusation meant to provoke, but as an observation he could not ignore. And Clara's reaction was immediate, a flicker of something crossing her face before she looked away again, her composure tightening as if she were pulling herself back together piece by piece. "You do not get to decide that," she replied, her voice steadier now but still low, still controlled, and Adrian took a small step closer, closing the remaining distance just enough to make the moment feel more private, more intense, even in the middle of a crowded room. "Then, give me something that makes sense," he said, his tone no longer just firm but edged with something deeper, something that came from the part of him that refused to walk away from unanswered questions. And for a moment it seemed like she might, like the pressure of the moment might finally push her past the point of holding back. But instead she drew in a slow breath, her shoulders straightening as she forced her composure back into place. "I have work to do," she said, the words simple but deliberate, a clear attempt to end the conversation. And before he could respond, before he could push further, a voice called her name from across the room, sharp and impatient, pulling her attention away, and Clara seized that interruption without hesitation, turning slightly as if it gave her permission to leave, to escape the conversation she had been trying to avoid from the start. And as she moved to step past him, her shoulder brushing lightly against his arm, Adrian caught one final detail, something small but impossible to ignore, the name printed neatly on a folded paper tucked into her apron pocket, a medical appointment reminder, partially visible, just enough for him to read the date before it disappeared from view. And in that instant, everything inside him sharpened again, because the date did not align with the version of events he had been holding on to. And as Clara walked away, leaving his question unanswered, one thought settled heavily in his mind. This was not over, not even close. Adrian did not return to his table right away, even as Clara disappeared back into the rhythm of the restaurant, her figure blending once again into the flow of servers and guests as if nothing had happened, as if their conversation had not just shifted something fundamental between them. And yet for him, everything had changed, because the single detail he had caught, that brief glimpse of a date on the paper in her pocket, refused to leave his mind. It replayed over and over with increasing clarity, forcing him to align it against the timeline he had trusted for months. And the more he thought about it, the less it made sense, because the date suggested something earlier. Something closer to the final weeks of their marriage. Not after, not separate, but overlapping in a way he had not allowed himself to consider. And that realization settled heavily in his chest as he finally turned back toward his table, his steps slower now, more deliberate, because he was no longer returning to the same place he had left. He was returning with a question that could not be ignored. And when he reached his seat, Vanessa was already watching him, her posture unchanged but her expression far more focused, far more intent. "Well," she said quietly, her eyes searching his face. "Was it worth it?" And Adrian did not answer immediately, because the truth was not simple, not something he could summarize in a single sentence. Not when every second of that conversation had only deepened the uncertainty instead of resolving it. And he reached for his glass again, this time actually lifting it, taking a slow sip as if buying himself a moment to organize his thoughts. But even that did nothing to quiet the tension building inside him. "She did not answer," he said finally, setting the glass down with controlled precision, and Vanessa's brows lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in confirmation of something she had already suspected. "Of course she did not," she replied, her tone calm, but edged with a quiet certainty. "Because if it were simple, you would not be standing here like this." And Adrian exhaled slowly, leaning back just slightly in his chair, but his gaze drifted again, almost involuntarily, back toward the area where Clara had gone, searching for her without fully realizing it. "It is not simple," he admitted, and Vanessa studied him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable but far from indifferent. "Then let it stay complicated," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Some things are better left alone," and that might have worked. Might have been enough on any other day, in any other situation, but not now, not after what he had seen, not after the pieces that refused to fit together. And he shook his head slightly, almost to himself, because leaving it alone would not restore order. It would only leave a gap, a question mark in something that demanded clarity, and his mind returned again to that date, the one detail that did not align, the one piece that suggested his assumptions had been wrong. And as he replayed it again, more precisely this time, something shifted, something clicked into place with a clarity that made his chest tighten, because the timing, when recalculated without the bias he had been holding on to, no longer ruled him out. It placed him directly within the possibility he had been trying to dismiss, and that realization changed everything, because now this was not just about curiosity, not just about unresolved history. It was about responsibility, about a truth that might have been hidden from him. And across the room Clara reappeared briefly, moving toward the service station again, her hand once more brushing lightly against her stomach in that same instinctive gesture. And this time Adrian did not look away, his focus locking onto her with a new intensity, because now he was no longer questioning whether this mattered. He was questioning how much it mattered. And as that thought settled fully into place, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. If the timeline was right, then he had not just walked away from a marriage, he might have walked away from something far more significant without ever knowing it. The realization did not fade with time. It only settled deeper, heavier, more defined, until Adrian could no longer treat it as a possibility, but as something that demanded action. And yet he remained seated, his posture composed, his expression controlled, because years of discipline did not disappear in a single moment, even when everything beneath the surface was shifting. And across from him Vanessa watched in silence now, her earlier questions replaced by a careful observation, as if she understood that whatever was happening inside him had moved beyond conversation, beyond anything she could influence with words. And Adrian's gaze drifted once more across the room, finding Clara again as she stood near the service station, speaking briefly with another server before turning away, her movements slower now, more measured, and this time when she paused, it was longer, her hand pressing lightly against her stomach as she took a steady breath, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the strain she could no longer fully hide. and that single moment removed any remaining distance he had tried to maintain, because it was no longer just about timelines or logic. It was about what was right in front of him, undeniable and real, and the thought that had formed earlier returned with greater force. Clearer now, sharper, because if he had miscalculated, if he had dismissed something that should have mattered, then the consequences were no longer abstract. They were personal, immediate, and impossible to ignore. Adrian, Vanessa said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them, her voice softer now, but carrying a seriousness that had not been there before, and he turned his attention back to her, though only partially, because part of him remained fixed on Clara, unable to fully disengage. You are not coming back from this the same, she continued, her words measured, not accusing but not entirely neutral either, and Adrian held her gaze for a moment, considering that, because she was not wrong, something had already changed, something fundamental that could not be undone simply by walking away. No, he admitted, his voice low but certain, and Vanessa exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly as if creating space between them, as if preparing herself for what might come next. Then be sure you know what you are stepping into, she said, her tone steady, and Adrian nodded once, a small but definitive motion, because uncertainty was no longer enough reason to hesitate, not when clarity was within reach, and without another word he stood again, the movement drawing less attention this time as the rhythm of the restaurant continued around him, and he did not hesitate as he crossed the room once more, his focus locked onto Clara with a precision that left no room for doubt, because this time he was not approaching with a question alone, he was approaching with intent, with the understanding that whatever answer he found would change the course of everything that came after, and as he reached her again, she looked up almost immediately, as if she had felt his presence before he spoke, her expression tightening just slightly as she realized he had not let it go, had not accepted her silence as an answer, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had already been said and everything that remained unsaid filling the space between them, until Adrian finally broke the silence, his voice lower now, more controlled, but carrying a certainty that had not been there before. That date, he said, his eyes steady on hers, the one in your pocket. And Clara's reaction was immediate, a flicker of alarm crossing her face before she could hide it, confirming more than any explanation could have, and Adrian did not look away, did not soften his gaze, because he had already seen enough. It does not match what I thought. He continued, each word deliberate, precise. It places me exactly where I should not be. And Clara inhaled sharply, her composure cracking just slightly under the pressure of that statement, her hand instinctively moving again to her stomach as if bracing herself. And in that moment, the truth felt closer than ever, just within reach, just beyond the barrier she had been holding in place. And Adrian stepped just a fraction closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, not for secrecy but for intensity. You can tell me it is nothing, he said, his tone steady but unyielding. But your eyes are saying something else. And Clara's gaze locked onto his, the distance between them narrowing into something fragile and unavoidable. And for a second it seemed like she might finally speak, might finally let the truth surface. But instead she shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a breath as she answered, You are too late. And the words landed with a weight that shifted everything once again, because they did not close the question. They opened something else entirely, something far more complicated. And as Adrian stood there, trying to process what that meant, one realization settled into place with quiet certainty. Whatever this truth was, it had already been unfolding without him, and catching up to it might cost far more than he was prepared to lose.